November 1944. Somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. A German officer steps off a prison train expecting to find a struggling, war-torn nation. Instead, he sees endless factories, highways packed with civilian cars, and guards casually throwing away food his family would kill for back home. In that moment, watching a Coca-Cola truck make its daily delivery to the POW camp, he realized something that shattered everything he'd been told. Germany had already lost, and they never stood a chance. But what specific sight made him understand that American industrial power was so overwhelming that the war's outcome was never even in doubt? Hans Müller stood in the rubble of what used to be a factory in Essen. The year was 1943, and the British bombers came almost every night now. He was 24 years old, and he remembered when these same buildings hummed with the sound of machines making steel. His father had worked here for 30 years. Now, the roof was gone. The walls had holes big enough to drive a truck through. Workers tried to fix the machines with parts pulled from other broken machines. There were never enough parts. There was never enough of anything. Hans had studied engineering before the war. He learned how factories worked, how to make things faster and better. The professors told him that German engineering was the best in the world. German machines were stronger. German workers were smarter. German tanks and planes would win the war because they were simply better than anything the enemy could make. Hans believed this with all his heart. When he put on his uniform in 1942, he felt proud. Germany would show the world what real industrial power looked like. His mother gave him half a loaf of bread the day he left for training. It was dark and heavy, made with sawdust mixed in because there was not enough flour. She had saved her rations for 2 weeks to give him this. Her face was thin. Everyone's face was thin now. But the radio said they were winning. The radio said America was weak and divided. The radio said American soldiers did not know how to fight, that their factories made cheap junk, that their people were soft and lazy. Hans believed the radio. He had to believe it. What else was there to believe? The war took him to France. He saw the Atlantic Wall, the big guns pointing at the sea. Officers said no army could break through. Then the Americans came in June of 1944, and the wall broke in one day. Hans fought for 3 weeks. He saw American tanks that seemed to never run out of fuel. He saw American planes that filled the sky like clouds. He saw American supplies stacked so high they looked like metal mountains. On a Tuesday morning in July, a shell exploded near his position. He woke up in American hands. The ship that took him across the ocean was huge. It had been a passenger ship once, before the war. Now it carried 2,000 German prisoners in its belly. The men sat in tight rows below deck. They were given soup twice a day. The soup had real meat in it. Hans had not tasted real meat in months. Some of the men cried when they ate it. Others refused to eat, saying it was a trick. Hans ate. He was hungry, and being proud did not fill your stomach. The crossing took 12 days. Hans spent most of it thinking. He thought about the size of the ship. Germany had ships, but not like this. He thought about the food. If the Americans could feed 2,000 prisoners real meat soup while crossing an ocean, what did that mean? He pushed the thought away. It was too big, too frightening to think about. The train ride started at night. They arrived at a port in New York and loaded onto trains while it was still dark. Hans pressed his face to the window, but he could only see shadows. The train had real seats, not wooden benches. It was warm inside. The German trains were cold now, because there was no coal to spare for heating. This American train was warm in October. Hans noticed everything. He could not help himself. He fell asleep as the train rolled west. When he opened his eyes, the sun was coming up. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. Fields stretched in every direction. So far he could not see where they ended. The fields were full of corn, tall and golden. There were no bomb craters, no burned barns, no signs of war at all. Just corn and more corn, going on forever. Then came a town. The buildings stood straight and whole. Their windows had glass. Their roofs were perfect. Cars sat parked on clean streets. Not one car or two cars, but dozens of them. Regular people owned these cars. Hans saw a woman loading bags into one. She was not thin. She was not wearing patched clothes. She looked like someone from before the war, when things were normal. Another German prisoner, a man named Klaus from Berlin, stared out the window with his mouth open. "Where are the ruins?" he whispered. "Where is the hunger?" No one answered him. They all saw the same thing. America looked like the war was not even happening. The train passed through 3 more towns. Everyone looked the same. Whole, fed, untouched. The camp appeared just before noon. Hans expected mud and wire and guards with mean faces. What he saw instead made him feel like he was dreaming. The barracks were wooden buildings painted white. They had real windows with screens to keep bugs out. The paths between buildings were gravel, neat and straight. There was grass. Someone had planted grass and cut it short, like a park. Near the gate stood a flagpole with the American flag moving in the wind. Everything was clean. Everything was organized. Everything looked new. The gates opened, and the prisoners climbed down from the train. An American officer stood waiting. He was young, maybe 30. His uniform was perfect, not patched or mended. He wore boots that were shiny and new. He smiled at them. "Welcome to Camp Perry," he said in bad German. "You will be safe here. You will be fed. You will be treated fairly." Hans looked at the camp again. He looked at the officer's new boots. He looked at the grass. Something cold and heavy settled in his stomach. This was a prison camp. Just a prison camp. And it looked better than most German towns he had seen in the past year. If this was how America treated its enemies, what did that say about everything else? The first meal came 2 hours after they arrived. The prisoners lined up outside a long building that smelled like cooking food. Hans had not smelled real cooking in so long that it made his knees weak. Inside, American soldiers stood behind tables piled with food. They put things on Hans's metal tray without saying much. A piece of white bread, a scoop of beans with pieces of ham in them, potatoes with butter melting on top, an apple. A cup of coffee that was actually black and hot. Not the brown water made from burned grain that they called coffee in Germany. Hans sat at a wooden table with Klaus and 3 other men. They stared at their trays. One man started eating very fast, like someone might take the food away. Another man cried. Klaus picked up the white bread and squeezed it. "It's soft," he said. "It's real white bread." His voice shook. Back home, white bread was something you only saw in old photographs now. Hans ate slowly. The ham tasted like ham should taste. The coffee was bitter and strong and perfect. When he finished, his stomach felt full for the first time in a year. An American soldier walked past and asked if anyone wanted more. More. There was more. Hans shook his head, but Klaus went back and got another piece of bread. He wrapped it in his handkerchief to save. The American soldier saw this and smiled but said nothing. This happened 3 times every day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Always enough food. It's always hot. Always real. After 5 days, Hans stopped feeling hungry all the time. His body began to remember what normal felt like, but his mind grew more confused. The propaganda films he had watched before the war showed Americans standing in bread lines during their depression. They showed hungry children and closed factories. Those films were from the 1930s, the officers said, but Americans were still weak and poor. Yet here was Hans, a prisoner, eating better than any civilian in Germany, better than most German soldiers. How could both things be true? On his 8th day, Hans was assigned to work. 50 prisoners climbed into trucks that took them 15 miles to a town called Millbrook. The factory there processed food for the military. Hans expected a small building with a few machines. What he saw instead made him stop walking. The factory was enormous. It stretched for 3 full blocks. Trucks lined up at 6 different loading docks. The building was new. The paint was fresh. Every window was whole. Inside, the noise hit him first. Machines running smoothly, all at once, in perfect rhythm. Hans had worked in German factories. He knew what broken equipment sounded like, the grinding and wheezing when parts were worn out. These machines purred. They were well-oiled and well-maintained. An American foreman named Mr. Jackson showed them what to do. They would pack cans of vegetables into boxes. The cans came down a long belt that moved by itself. The boxes were already folded, already ready. Everything was designed to be fast and easy. Hans watched the cans go by. Hundreds of them, thousands. He started counting in his head. This one line could pack more cans in an hour than the entire factory in Essen could pack in a day. And this was just one line. There were 12 lines in this building. And this was just one building. And Millbrook was just a small town. His hands moved automatically, packing boxes, but his mind was calculating. If this small town could produce this much, what could a real city produce? What could 10 cities produce? What could America produce? At noon, a bell rang. The machines stopped. Everyone walked to a big room with tables and chairs. Lunch was served there, sandwiches made with white bread and real meat, fruit, cookies, and then a man pushed in a cart with small paper cups on it. "Ice cream," Mr. Jackson said. "Vanilla today." Hans took a cup. The ice cream was cold and sweet and impossible. Making ice cream required milk and sugar and machines that froze things. It required extra. It required having so much that you could waste some on small pleasures. Klaus ate his ice cream in tiny bites, making it last. "This is mad," he whispered. "We're prisoners eating ice cream while the war is still happening." After lunch, while they worked, Hans heard a truck pull up outside. Through the window, he saw an American worker directing it. The truck was red and white with words painted on the side, Coca-Cola. The driver jumped out and loaded cases of bottles onto a dolly. He was whistling. The whole thing took 5 minutes. Then the truck drove away to make more deliveries. Hans thought about German supply trucks. They were patched together from broken parts. They ran on wood gas because there was no petrol. The drivers did not whistle. But here was a truck delivering soda. Not food, not medicine, just soda. To factories and stores and whoever wanted it. Every single day. The American guards at the camp wore new uniforms. Hans noticed this over the first 2 weeks. The uniforms were thick wool, clean and pressed. The boots were leather with good soles. Every guard had 2 sets, maybe 3. They changed them often. Hans's uniform was the same one he had been captured in. It had been washed, but there were still holes in it from branches and wire. The elbows were worn thin. His boots had cardboard inside where the soles had cracked. Before the war, German uniforms were the best in the world. Now they looked like rags compared to what a regular American soldier wore. On Sunday, someone left a newspaper on a bench near the barracks. Hans picked it up. His English was not perfect, but he could read enough. The newspaper had photos of ships being built. Big ships, the kind that carried supplies across oceans. The headline said 12 new Liberty ships had been launched this week. This week, 12 ships. In 1 week. Hans knew Germany's entire shipbuilding capacity. They could not build 12 large ships in 6 months, not anymore. Not with the bombing, not with the shortages. But America built 12 in 7 days and put it in the newspaper like it was normal news. Klaus found Hans reading and sat down next to him. "Do you remember what they told us?" Klaus said. "They said America was too weak to fight a real war. They said Americans only cared about money and comfort. They said we would win because we were willing to sacrifice." Hans folded the newspaper. He looked at the clean barracks. He thought about the ice cream and the Coca-Cola truck and the 12 ships. "We were lied to," he said quietly. Klaus nodded. "But it's worse than that," Klaus said. "I don't think they were even trying yet. I think this is them barely getting started." The two men sat in silence while the sun set over Ohio. Thanksgiving came in late November. Hans did not know what Thanksgiving was. The Americans tried to explain it, something about pilgrims and harvest and being grateful. It sounded strange to Hans. A holiday just for saying thank you for food seemed like something only people with plenty of food would think to create. The camp cook said there would be a special meal. Hans expected maybe extra bread or a piece of cake. He did not expect what happened. They set up tables in the mess hall with white paper cloths. The smell started in the morning and did not stop. By noon, the whole camp smelled like roasting meat and fresh bread and something sweet Hans could not name. When the doors opened at 1 o'clock, Hans saw the tables covered with food. Not just covered, buried. There was a whole turkey for every 8 men. Not small turkeys. Big ones, golden brown, with juice running down the sides. There were bowls of potatoes mashed with butter and cream. There were vegetables in colors Hans had forgotten food could be. Orange carrots, green beans, dark red sauce made from berries. There were rolls, soft and warm, sitting in baskets lined with cloth. There was pie, 3 different kinds of pie. The camp commander stood up before anyone ate. He was a colonel named Webb, an older man with gray hair and a kind face. He said they were far from home, all of them, but today they would eat like Americans eat. "We feed you what our boys eat," he said, "what my own son is eating right now in France. You are prisoners, but you are also men, and today we share this meal as men." Some of the Germans did not understand English well, so someone translated. When they understood, several men put their heads down. One man left the room. Hans filled his plate. He tried to take only a little, but the American soldiers kept putting more food on. "Try the sweet potatoes," one said. "You need gravy on that. Don't forget the cranberry sauce." Hans sat down with Klaus and 4 others. They ate in silence for a long time. The turkey was tender and rich. The potatoes were smooth and buttery. Everything tasted like something from a memory. From before the war. From when the world was normal. Hans thought about his mother. She was probably eating potato soup, if she was eating at all. Maybe she had 1 carrot. Maybe a piece of old bread. His father was probably at the factory, if the factory still stood, eating nothing until evening. And here was Hans, a prisoner, eating a feast. Klaus put down his fork. His eyes were wet. "My family hasn't seen this much food in 2 years," he said. "Not combined. Not if you added up everything they've eaten for 2 years. And we're prisoners. We're the enemy." Hans had been thinking the same thing, but hearing Klaus say it out loud made it real. "What does that mean?" Klaus said. "If they treat their enemies better than our government treats its own people?" No one at the table had an answer. 3 days later, Hans's work assignment changed. They needed men at a different factory, one that made parts for airplanes. The factory was 30 miles away in a city called Marion. It took an hour to get there in the truck. When they arrived, Hans thought there had been a mistake. The building was massive, bigger than anything he had seen outside of Berlin. It was made of concrete, steel, and glass. It was new. It looked like it had been built yesterday. Inside, the scale of everything made Hans feel small. The ceiling was so high that birds flew around up there. The floor space was so large you could fit 10 soccer fields inside. And everywhere, as far as Hans could see, there were machines making airplane parts. Not whole airplanes, just parts, just one type of part. This entire enormous building made one component for the B-17 bomber. A man named Thompson showed them around. He was the floor manager. He had gray hair and spoke with an accent. When Hans asked where he was from, Thompson smiled. "Leipzig," he said. "I came here in 1936. "You speak German," Hans said, shocked. Thompson nodded. "My parents brought me when I was 12. Now I'm American. Now I make parts that help beat the country I was born in." He said it without shame or hesitation, like it was simply a fact. Thompson showed them the production line. Each station did one small job. One machine drilled holes. Another machine smoothed edges. Another checked measurements. The parts moved from station to station on belts that never stopped. Thompson pulled out a chart from his pocket. "See this," he said, pointing to numbers. "This factory makes 1,500 of these parts every day." Hans stared at the number. 1,500 parts. Every day. Just this one factory. Just this one part. Thompson kept talking. "We have 15 factories making just this component," he said. 15. All across Ohio and Pennsylvania. Some in Michigan, too. Hans did math in his head. 15 factories. 1,500 parts each. Every single day. The number was so big it felt fake. Hans asked the question he was afraid to ask. How many parts does Germany make? Thompson looked at him for a long moment. "I shouldn't tell you this," he said, "but the war is almost over anyway. Our intelligence says Germany's entire aircraft production, all your factories combined, makes about 800 planes per month. We make that many in a week. Just America. Not counting Britain. Not counting Russia. Just us." Hans felt the floor tilt under his feet. That night, Hans sat on his bunk with a small notebook the Americans had given him. They were allowed to write letters home, but the letters were checked and took months to arrive. Instead, Hans wrote for himself. He wrote in German, small words in cramped handwriting. "We were told America was weak," he wrote. "We were told they were divided and soft and could not fight a real war. But they are not even trying yet. And they are drowning us in steel. They feed prisoners turkey while they build 15 factories for one airplane part. We did not lose this war. We never had a chance to win it. The war was over before it started. We just didn't know." Klaus came and sat next to him. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The truth," Hans said. Klaus nodded slowly. "Do you understand what this means?" Klaus said. "It means everything we were told was a lie. It means all the men who died for nothing. It means our leaders sent us to fight a war, They knew we couldn't win. Hans closed the notebook. "It means worse than that," he said. "It means we built our whole country on the idea that we were superior. That German blood and German will and German strength made us better than everyone else. But power isn't about blood or will. It's about how much steel you can make, how much food you can grow, how many trucks you have to deliver Coca-Cola. We thought we were strong because we could suffer and sacrifice, but they're strong because they don't have to." The two men sat in the dark barracks. Outside, an American truck drove past, its engine running smooth and quiet. Somewhere, a radio played music. Big band jazz, the kind the propaganda said was degenerate. It sounded happy. It sounded like people who were winning and knew it. Hans thought about home. He thought about his mother's thin face and his father's patched uniform and the factory with holes in its roof. He thought about the 12 Liberty ships launched in 1 week, and the ice cream at lunch, and the 15 factories making one part. The propaganda told them that Germans were superior because they were willing to sacrifice everything for victory. But America was winning without sacrifice. They were winning while eating pie and drinking Coca-Cola and giving ice cream to prisoners. That was real power. Not the power to suffer, but the power to have so much that suffering wasn't necessary. Hans finally understood. Germany had lost before the first shot was fired. They had lost because they never understood what they were fighting against. The ship that brought Hans home arrived in Bremen in July of 1946. More than a year had passed since the war ended. The Americans kept the prisoners longer because Germany had no food, no jobs, and no place to put millions of returning soldiers. When Hans finally stepped onto German soil, he barely recognized it. The dock was half destroyed. Cranes stood broken and rusting. Buildings that once lined the waterfront were just walls with no roofs. Piles of rubble sat everywhere, some as tall as houses. Women and old men picked through the rubble looking for bricks that could be used again. Everyone looked thin. Everyone looked tired. The train to Essen took 2 days. It should have taken 6 hours, but the tracks were damaged in so many places that the train had to stop and wait while workers fixed the rails ahead. Hans sat by a window and watched Germany pass by. Every city looked the same. Broken, burned, empty. In some places, there were no buildings left at all, just flat spaces covered in brick dust where neighborhoods used to be. Children played in the ruins. They were barefoot and dirty, and their clothes hung loose on their small bodies. Hans thought about the American children he had seen from the truck windows in Ohio. Those children had been round and clean, and their shoes fit. Essen looked worse than anywhere else. The British had bombed it over and over because of the factories. Hans's family home was in the north part of the city, near where his father's factory had been. When the train stopped, Hans climbed down with his small bag. The Americans had given each prisoner new clothes before they left. Hans wore American pants and an American shirt and American shoes. His old uniform had been thrown away. Some of the returning Germans stared at him with hard eyes. He looked too healthy. He looked too well fed. He looked like someone who had not suffered enough. He walked through streets he had known his whole life. Most of the buildings were gone. The ones still standing had no glass in the windows. People had covered the windows with wood or cloth or nothing at all. Hans turned a corner and saw his street. His heart beat faster. Then he saw his house, or what was left of it. The front wall still stood. One side wall was there too, but the back of the house was gone, blown away by a bomb. The roof was mostly missing. Someone had put boards across part of it to keep rain out of one room. Clothes hung on a line in what used to be the kitchen. His family was still living there, in the ruins. Because there was nowhere else to go, his mother saw him first. She was hanging wet clothes on the line. She looked so much older than he remembered. Her hair was completely gray now. Her dress was patched in a dozen places. When she recognized him, she dropped the shirt she was holding and ran. She hugged him and cried and touched his face like she was checking to make sure he was real. His father came out from the one room with a roof. He walked with a cane now. His back was bent. He looked at Hans for a long time without speaking. Then he nodded. "You're back," he said. That was all. Just those 2 words. They sat in the room that still had a roof. Hans's younger sister was there too. She was 17 now, old enough that Hans barely knew her. She stared at him with suspicious eyes. There was a small table and 4 chairs and 2 beds. That was all the furniture they had left. Everything else had been sold or traded for food. His mother made tea from dried leaves that were not actually tea. There was no sugar. There was barely any water. She apologized for not having real food to offer. "We get rations," she said, "but it's never enough. Maybe twice a week we have bread." Hans felt sick. He opened his bag and pulled out what he had brought. The Americans had given each prisoner a care package before they left. Chocolate bars, canned milk, coffee, soap. Hans put it all on the table. His mother stared at it like it was gold. His father asked about the camp. Was it very hard? He wanted to know. Did they treat you badly? Did you stay strong for Germany? Hans did not know how to answer. He pulled out the small photos he had been allowed to keep. They showed the barracks at Camp Perry. They showed the mess hall. One photo showed Hans and Klaus standing next to the factory in Marion. His mother picked up the photos with shaking hands. "This is where you were," she asked. "This is the prison." Hans nodded. His father leaned close to look. The buildings in the photos were clean and whole. "You can see grass," his sister said. Her voice was angry. "There's grass growing, like a park. How can there be grass at a prison camp?" Hans tried to explain. He told them about the food. 3 meals every day. Real meat. White bread. His mother interrupted. "White bread," she said. "You had white bread. Every day." Hans nodded. "We had white bread every day for 2 years. On Thanksgiving, we had turkey and pie." His sister stood up fast. Her chair fell backward. "We were starving," she said. Her voice was loud and shaking. "We ate grass soup and sawdust bread, and you were eating turkey. The enemy fed you turkey while we starved." She left the room. Hans heard her crying outside. His father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We fought until the end. We were loyal. We did our duty." Hans looked at his father's bent back and his mother's gray hair and the ruined house around them. Loyal to what? Hans wanted to ask, but he stayed silent. What could he say? That their leaders had lied. That the war was unwinnable from the start. That Germany had sent millions of men to die for nothing. These were true things, but saying them out loud would not fix the broken house, or bring back the dead, or fill his mother's empty stomach. The weeks passed. Hans registered with the occupation authorities. The Americans were in charge now. They needed people who spoke English and understood engineering. Hans became an interpreter for the reconstruction office. He helped translate documents and explain American methods to German workers. The Marshall Plan was starting. American money and American supplies were coming to rebuild. His father did not like this. "We don't need their charity," he said. "We can rebuild ourselves." But Hans had seen the rubble. He had seen the starving children and the broken factories. Germany could not rebuild itself. not alone. Not for many years. Packages started arriving from America. Care packages, they were called. They had food and clothes and soap. Hans's mother cried when they opened the first one. "The enemy is feeding us," she said. She could not understand it. Hans tried to explain. "They want us to recover," he said. "They want Germany to be strong again, so we can buy their goods and be their partners. It's not charity, it's business." But even as he said it, he remembered Colonel Webb saying, "They were all men sharing a meal." He remembered the ice cream at the factory. Some of it was business, but some of it was something else. Something about having so much that you could afford to be generous. Something about power being more than just force. Years passed. Hans married. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. He used his engineering knowledge to help rebuild Essen's factories. But he built them the American way, with efficiency in mind, with room to grow, with the understanding that abundance was better than suffering. In 1955, his son asked about the war. The boy was 8. He had found Hans's old photos from Camp Perry. "Why were you smiling in this picture?" the boy asked. "You were a prisoner." Hans looked at the photo. He and Klaus are standing by the factory, both of them looking healthy and well-fed. The American guard who took the picture had told them to smile. Hans thought about how to answer. He thought about the 12 Liberty ships and the 15 factories and the Coca-Cola truck. He thought about his mother's thin face when he came home, and the grass at the prison camp, and the ice cream on Tuesdays. Finally he said, "I went to America believing we were superior. I came home knowing we had been lied to. The real power was never about who could suffer the most. It was about who had so much they didn't need to suffer at all. We lost the war before it started because we never understood what we were really fighting. We thought strength was about will and sacrifice, but strength is about production and resources and knowing when you have enough that you can even take care of your enemies. That's what I learned as a prisoner. That's what America taught me." The boy did not fully understand, but he would someday. Hans put the photo in a box with the others. These were not memories of defeat. They were proof of the moment he learned to see the world clearly. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the people you thought were your enemies. Sometimes losing a war means winning the chance to finally understand the truth.